so nice to see you here back. I'm Edda, and this is Chris. Oh, sorry. And yeah, we have our last lecture today from this Initiative Festival, together with Jeff Barnums. And he will talk about why actions in social change might fail and how you can let them actually work. And Chris will shortly introduce Jeff.
Jeff has experience in social change and is an artist also called Apocalypse. Please welcome him to the stage.
Hi everyone. I'm going to follow my notes here and just take my time. We're going to cover quite a bit of terrain here because we need to do that just to get to a new beginning point. And this new beginning point that I'm going to attempt to share is, in fact, another paradigm, not only of change, but of reality, you could say. And so, during the course of what I'll share with you, I'm going to straddle, go between thoughts that you will be used to and thoughts that you may not be used to. Okay, so as we go into the truly new terrain, I will do my best to go fast by going slow, like really cover the terrain by going slow, but make big leaps. That said, if English isn't your first language and you feel lost, or if you have a question, even if it is your first language and you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll listen to your question and try to incorporate it as we go. Okay? So I want to begin with by anchoring our work today in the hope that lives in you. And by that I mean this hope of making a contribution. Most of you are under 30. And when you're in that age, you feel your life in front of you, and you feel that that hope that comes with your life. All right? So this lecture will be a tiny stick on the flame of that hope to make it worth it. And if you're older than that, then you've maybe begun to experience the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and the setbacks and the hardships and the dead ends, and I'm with you there as well. And I think often as you grow older, you really start to ask, what is happening and what can be done? I was also, once upon a time in my early 20s, full of hope for my life, and I was given some very cool opportunities to foster that hope and nourish that flame. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit of my story so that you know who I am and who's talking to you and on what basis I'm sharing what I'm sharing. I'm sharing things that I've experienced and that I've studied, but that I've lived. So I began as an artist, and when I was about 19, I discovered that I could really make art. I didn't know then that that's pretty much all I could do. But I discovered that I could make art. And I got very interested in the question of creative capacity. I asked myself, I made this great, awesome piece of art for which I'm very proud, but I also made this total failure over here. What's the difference? What's going on in me that makes the difference? And I began to ask questions about what I now call creative consciousness, which I then called just creativity. What is creativity? How does it work? But what occurred to me was also the question of how is creativity useful for humanity? So these were the early 90s, and the wall had fallen, and apartheid had ended in South Africa. It was a time, you could say, between the Cold War and the War on Terror. The 90s was this cool decade of cultural explosion at the end of the Cold War and before the Twin Towers. But still, I had a sense that we needed to understand creativity and its application in the world for humanity's benefit. And I found a mentor, first in Dennis Klocek, who used to be a teacher at the Rudolf Steiner College, who's an esotericist, and who showed me and those of us who took his course about the phenomenology of the soul. So the phenomena of the inner life. How do we learn to observe our inner life and transform our habits and compulsions into capacities? So this is the first sort of pillar, is inner development. And from there, I met Michal Pogacnik, the cultural ambassador of Slovenia, who's a violinist. And he's now, must be about 80, lives in Slovenia. But for his whole career, he has brought people together around music and intercultural meeting. So he showed me and demonstrated to those of us who worked with him, in a way, many approaches to bridging divides through intercultural dialogue. In other words, making art and not war. And I got the chance to meet the mucky mucks, the elite, the leaders of UN, the politicians, world leaders, CEOs, important people who were doing their best to bring value to not only their organizations or their countries, but humanity. These were Michal's friends, and I became interested in the kind of people who worked with them and supported them, made friends with such people, and eventually co-founded a company called Rios Partners, doing what's called complexity consulting. And what we did at Rios, so I've now taken you from about 1993, when I graduated to college, to 2007, when I co-founded Rios Partners with a man named Adam Kahane. Now, Adam Kahane, when I met him, he was my age. I'm 50, so he was about 50. I was 35 or so, roughly. Maybe he was a bit younger, whatever. But when he was 30 or so, he found himself helping South Africa transition out of apartheid, using a methodology called scenario planning. It's basically a way of people getting together and thoughtfully thinking about the future, thoughtfully seeing possibilities of the future. And through this exercise, he was able to help the ANC, the African National Congress, I think that's the ANC, right? The Liberation Party in South Africa. They learned through this exercise that they actually needed the National Party. They needed the establishment to avoid tanking the economy of South Africa. So this was an early victory for him, and on this victory he built his reputation. And through a number of circuitous events, I found myself business partners with Adam Kahane at Rios. And over the next 7 years was able to travel with Adam and other people at Rios and learned how to organize and run multi-stakeholder collaborations and dialogues. And I'll tell you about that in a moment in more detail. So I've had this, for 7 years, I had this opportunity to gain experience, you could say, on the world stage, rubbing shoulders with and supporting people, not necessarily in the top tiers of power, but in pretty top tiers of power. And there I learned why it doesn't work. Or you could say the limits of those kinds of engagements. And I also found what does work. So I'm going to share some stories and go into this in detail in the next half an hour or so. After a while, I grew frustrated with seeing the same limitations, the same patterns again and again around the world in different environments, and started Magenta, which I'll tell you about with Louisa, as a much more humble, but in a way important initiative. And that eventually led me back to being an artist. So that's a bit about me. So now I'm gonna share with you some of my learning. Just for your benefit, I'm gonna walk you through what I learned over these years about the limits of social change as usual. So, can everybody see black, blue, and red? Anybody not see red? Okay. So I'm going to walk you through a hypothetical example, or I'll find some stories in myself that are real, but this is a bit theoretical, just as an abstraction to teach you what I've learned. Okay? So I'm going to try to ground this in stories. But as you listen, try to put yourself in the position of the people that I'll be describing. So you're a change agent. I'm just going to represent you as this little circle. And you're wanting to change some mess in the world. Oh well. And maybe you go to college, you go to school, you train in international diplomacy, you get a degree, you start an institute or a foundation or an initiative, and you want to pull together some people and some money and address this issue. And as you go, as you do that, especially as you age and you grow through your 20s and 30s and 40s, you learn that this mess is surrounded by other people who have, you could say, diverse views and interests. Maybe some of them see the problem like you do. They want the same things that you do. Maybe some of them are in direct opposition. They see the problem completely differently. So maybe you see the problem as saving a forest. Maybe they see the problem as preserving an economy, preserving jobs. And so after a time, you realize that, wow, it's more complicated than just thinking of an idea and winning people to my idea or raising money and implementing these actions. It's more complicated. It's more, you could say, there's some social complexity to this in that you have diverse views and diverse stakeholders. You would also learn that this problem is there for a reason. It's not just an accident, that it has causes that are far apart in space and time. So the problem of saving the forest then connects you with people's livelihoods that depend on that forest, or the fishery. And then you try to solve the problem of jobs related to the fishery, and you come up into this whole other set of parameters about the national or the regional or the global economy and the value of currency and so forth. So this problem has what Adam used to call dynamic complexity, meaning the causes of that problem are far apart in space and time. Not just solvable in that little fishery, because it's connected with things that are happening in the global economy. And then you will find the problem of what Adam used to call generative complexity. So I'll just write these on the boards. Dynamic causes are far apart in space and time. Social, diverse views and interests. And then generative, meaning humanity is facing problems that we've never solved before. There's no off-the-shelf solutions. There's nothing in the warehouse. There's no blueprint. There's no plan. Okay, so the messiest and most complex of social problems that humanity faces, we used to characterize in this way. And so what we did for what I did for many years, and what Rios still does, my friends at Rios with whom I'm on very good terms, still do, is they would bring these stakeholders together in a dialogue and say, look, people, the stakes are too high for us to remain enemies or strangers. So instead of each of us working maybe at odds, maybe pushing in different directions, or maybe duplicating efforts and being redundant, why don't we work together across institutions, across organizations, across cultures, across every kind of border to really solve this problem? And a lot of these people, you could imagine that they would have resistance to this because, well, why would I listen to that guy? Because he's my enemy. He wants to save the forest and I'm trying to save the jobs. Or why would we listen to each other when we've been fighting for 30 years? And that guy or that woman, that person was on the other side of the civil war that we are just getting out of. So there is some finesse to inviting or convening people to talk together. And what I've found is that in certain circumstances, if you can get people talking, then green okay as well? Then you can get a very positive outcome, because people who are fighting will often stop fighting if they can start talking. So Adam and Rios are very good at this. They are masterful at this, and I learned that craft. And I will say, just as a personal anecdote, that I was an artist, remember, from Texas. And I found myself, through this circuitous path, working with these people on this amazing work. And a lot of people envied me. A lot of people were like, man, Jeff Barnum at Rios, that guy is so cool. I wish that was me. And I was like, yeah, it's cool, but I didn't have that aspiration. That wasn't my ambition to be that guy. Just a side note. Sounds glamorous, and there is a temptation to get caught up in the glamour of it. But there's a problem, okay? Because in situations of high complexity and mass destruction and civil war, or say restoring fisheries, or addressing soil loss, or protecting children, these issues present challenges that are not completely resolved by stopping fighting. Okay? The second imperative is that you build something together that works. If you want to solve a problem of overfishing, you can't just stop fishing because it's a subsistence level activity for millions of people around the world, right? You have to keep fishing. But then how do you fish in such a way that doesn't overfish? So now there's an interesting challenge to build a solution. Okay. So on the one hand, there's hope, okay? At the center of this dialogue, there's hope that we can do more together than we can alone. And there is the outcome of stop fighting. That's awesome. Then you have the challenge, however, of, you could say, building or creating the new. Now, I want to return to this flame of hope in your soul. If you think it through, you know, most of you are in your 20s and 25 and so on, so there's this flame of hope, and if you think it through, you'll realize that whatever you accomplish in life, you'll be dependent to one degree or another on other people. You're hopeful, you're assuming in a way that those other people will be there and that they'll meet you with what you need to do what you are here to do. But you can imagine if you do everything that is required of you and you show up to the ballroom and nobody's there to dance, if you show up and there's nobody there, or if there's something missing, then your dependency is not fulfilled, right? So we are dependent on each other. This is on this everything turns. How so? So once, when I was young, I had the good fortune to, when I was working with Miha, someone came to the castle where we were hosting festivals, and he was like going to Sarajevo. And this was just after the war had ended, a couple of years. Not so long that Bosnia had rebuilt itself, but long enough to know where the landmines were and to avoid them. Okay, so I took a 10-hour journey to Sarajevo from Slovenia. And the reason it took so long is that in wartime, the bridges are blown up. And so if you imagine a mountainous landscape going through Bosnia, for example, on the way to Sarajevo, you'd come on the road to a critical bridge and it would just be gone. And so what happened was that the Serbians blew up the bridges so that the Bosnians couldn't get supplies from Europe. And so the Bosnians then had to carve roads around the mountain passes by hand to eventually bypass the bridge. And instead of going on the bridge, we would have to take this rocky, mountain pass that they had carved out so that they could continue to get supplies, and it would take like half an hour instead of 30 seconds. So this fact that the bridges were out made things much more difficult. It took way longer. It was just extremely, nothing you could do about it. The bridges are out. Okay, and over time, what I saw in initiative after initiative, after dialogue, was the same feeling. Like we're putting all the pieces together. We're putting together the dream team of diverse leaders, from all around the challenge area. We've got the funding. We've got good ideas. We've got willingness. And over the years, it was, my Rios colleagues would really slap me on the wrist for saying this, but to be blunt, it was disappointment after disappointment. It was failure after failure after failure. Now, the good thing about being an artist is that when you make a work of art that sucks, like, you can't pretend it doesn't suck. If it sucks, okay? It just screams suck. And you have to, if you're going to be honest with yourself, you have to admit that it's just not yet there. And I approached these challenges, these projects with the same rigor. I said, what are the results? What are we achieving in our attempt to create the new? Because there's some wins here, okay? You get together a team of stakeholders. They've never worked together from across the system. They've never worked together across enemy lines, etc. Lawyers and teachers and policemen and service providers all helping to protect children. Like, that's never been done before in the history of the system. Cool. We got enough money to get the job done. We've got some awesome ideas. We've got some willingness. It's all fantastic. But how many children did we protect? How many families stopped beating their kids? Like, this was the fierce, sober analysis that I was doing. And it was similarly around indigenous issues or species loss or soil, or, right? Oh, the other thing we would have is initiatives. People getting out there and doing stuff, right? Cool. But what I found was when it came to real sort of results or outcomes, or you could even say changed systems. Delta is the shorthand for change, right? Then we would have to admit that we weren't changing systems. Now, why am I saying all this? Because if you're in this position, you may think that you need a dream team and more money and brilliant people and the willingness and great initiatives. But if you experience what I experienced, you will not see systems change. And this was my experience after 10 years of doing this work at all levels of power in many different sectors. I kept seeing what I began to call as invisible barriers. It was exactly as if we got everything together, we pulled up to the cliff and the bridges were out. We could not go further. Now, what did that look like in practical terms? Is there an eraser somewhere?
Here.
Oh, yeah.
Shall I just
Yeah. Can you just erase? Just erase everything but yeah, just erase that, yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so it took a lot of different forms. It looked like some trivial misunderstanding among key team members that then broke the relationship and sabotaged the project. Or it looked like maybe a minister in their political aspirations or in their public relations made a decision to stop innovating and invest in what we know how to do. Because that's what the public needed. They needed to know that not one more children would die, but everyone on the inside of the system knows that you can't promise that. But it looks good if you promise $70 million to the Child Protection Agency. But internally, they clamp down because we don't need to be messing around with innovation. We need to, bolster the services. So it took many different forms. It sometimes looked like more insidiously, sometimes it took the form that the funding institution wanted control of the initiative. So imagine the World Bank is going to provide money for restoring the world's poorest fisheries. They have some, hundreds of millions of dollars promised. When it gets down to it, you're nickel and diming for every $10,000. And then when it really comes time to it, you realize that there's no way that this is going to work because the World Bank wants the credit and the flex of the victory of helping for their PR, for their internal, whether it's the egotism of a person or just the way that the mindset works at the organization, we do the change work, meaning we bring the solution and we implement it in the fishery. Well, the people who run the fishery never go along with that. Elinor Ostrom did some Nobel Prize-winning work. She's an economist who helped explain this to me. We never talked. I read the book, right? But she shows that when people have a problem, like fishery, maintaining a fishery, that community has to own the solution. It has to be their idea, because that preserves their integrity as human beings. They're not going to take up an idea that comes to them from the World Bank and these top scientists who know nothing of their culture, who don't know their names. They're not involved. They want to come in and tell us how to do things from some boardroom somewhere. Doesn't work. So invisible barriers or points of fracture. And my point is, I saw this everywhere, always in a new form. This project, it was a relationship. This project, it was a funding organization that pulled the funding. This project, it was the institution running the thing wants the control of the idea. And I was like, what is this about? What is at the bottom of all of it? And then I started finding a completely different paradigm. Completely different paradigm. And this is where the story turns. And Pippin, you said you had to go at around 11:30. Yeah. So unfortunately, you'll miss the punchline here, but I'll try to catch you up later. I mean, I'm not dismissing you. You can stay if you want, but it is that time. Yeah. I'll catch you up, my man. Look. Now we go into another paradigm. But I want to anchor something that's extremely important, in my view at least, for the social future. Compliance occurs through, if you're going to preserve the integrity of a human being, compliance occurs through mutual agreement. Compliance. What does that? Obedience. You stop at a stop sign. Yeah. Obedience. Who's got a Danish word for compliance? We agree to stop at stop signs because if we run through stop signs, we might kill somebody. Yeah. So stop signs are an easy win. You could say it's easy to say yes to. You comply or you obey the law because it's easy to say yes to. There is a mutual agreement. But if you're in your 40s and you've been, aspiring in your career and now you have to obey some new bureaucratic requirement from somebody over in the boardroom, but it's not an easy yes, then you have resistance because it violates your integrity. You haven't made that agreement.
Like farmers in the EU, always new regulations.
Yeah.
And they're so angry.
Yeah, this is a perfect example. Power wants compliance. But when the human being has to comply with distant authorities, there's going to be resistance because it violates your integrity. This is why people on the ground have to own the solution if it's going to work. So if you're a leader, 99.99%, it's maybe an exaggeration, but maybe not, of change projects do what I will call plan and implement. These people get together, they come up with some great ideas, they turn them into initiatives, and they implement them. And it looks like this. We want to go from A to B. We have this big fancy plan, a PowerPoint, which we saw yesterday. We begin to roll it out, and we find barriers. In reality, what you encounter is this original mess. You encounter the reasons the mess is actually there. The reasons the mess is actually there, you could say the roots of the problem can be pictured as tough weeds. They have deep roots. You cut the weed and it just grows back. And it will show up in all kinds of forms. It will show up as leadership failures, as relationship and team breakdowns, as institutional failures, as policy failures, as government failure. It will take myriad forms. But you won't get to be, ever. Okay, so what do leaders do in this case? Well, the first thing they do is often what they'll do when they fail is they go back to the boardroom. Or we're going to take a strategic retreat. Some foundations will take a year off and just, rethink their strategy. I saw this year in and year out.
In these projects, do people in general even talk to the group or the society that has
Oh yeah.
received the solution?
Yeah.
Do they go there?
Oh yeah. There's a whole field of ethnographic research to go talk to people and build relationships. But there's hardly ever any inner development or communication skill training or creativity training. So they're still trying to implement something. Okay, so they usually go for some sort of greater kind of control, which occasionally becomes a kind of force, and eventually at its most extreme, tyranny. We're going to do this, and we will do everything in our power to get there. Even force, violence. So that's a mindset. That's a mindset of we know what's best and we're going to get it done. That's a paradigm. And you see it all over the spectrum. We know what's best, so we're going to cancel this racist. We know what's best, so we're going to freeze the bank accounts of the truckers' convoy. We know what's best, so we're going to pass vaccine mandates. We know what's best, we know what's best, we know what's best for you. Okay, and we're going to come up with a plan, and we're going to implement it. Tyranny includes sometimes war, propaganda. And remember, 5 years ago, these things were historical. It was like, oh yeah, back in the 20th century, people had propaganda and war and shit. So then I was wondering, back in the days, I studied Joseph Beuys. I need a glass of water. Could somebody get me one? Thank you so much. Back in the day when I was young, I studied the work of Joseph Beuys, who was himself a student of Rudolf Steiner. He talked about social sculpture. society as sculpture. And in my travels with Adam and in my work, I happened to learn about a particular guy called Antanas Mokas, who was, he ran for president in Colombia. He was not elected, due, I think, to some corruption. But he was the mayor of Bogota twice. Mokas, when he became mayor, he was a disgraced mathematician. Disgraced because as a professor at a university, he became frustrated with his auditorium full of students, and he mooned them. He pulled his pants down and showed his butt. And he made headlines, and he felt very ashamed, and he publicly apologized. But he captured the hearts of the population, so he ran for mayor and won. He's very articulate, and he's very humble, and you can just see his spiritual flame burning, in his soul. Thank you so much. Now, Mokas inherited this. When he became mayor, he became mayor of one of the world's most violent cities. Colombia had had decades, 3 or 4 or 5 decades of civil war. I don't remember how many. And people were traumatized in the most terrible ways. The most terrible things happened in Colombia in the Civil War. And in Bogota, one of the ways that this was coming to expression was through violence. Violence at epidemic levels, bigger than Houston. And I come from Houston. How do you deal with this? How do you help heal a nation or a city? And one of the ways that this was happening is that people were running over each other at intersections. In other words, the light would turn red and someone, where did my friend go? Talk to you. They would not stop at the stop sign. They would drive up over the sidewalk and go around the intersection and accidentally kill an old lady walking across the street, or a child, or someone going to work. And these pedestrian deaths were happening all over the city every day, which is crazy, right? Which means we've lost our humanity. So Mokas said, we've got to do something about this state of things. And he found in the pedestrian deaths a starting point. And one night, he and his cabinet were up late talking about this and what to do with it. And there's an old saying in Colombia that when all else fails, you send the clowns in. And this sent a shiver down Mokas's spine, and he had an idea, which was to employ, at first, 40 clowns, 40 mimes, to direct traffic. And so he put these 40 mimes at some of the worst intersections. And these mimes went out there, and they had signs. First, he had gold stars painted all across the city where people had been killed by reckless driving. Okay? So to have their spirits present in a subtle way. To call to mind what had happened there. Then he handed out hundreds of thousands of cards with green thumbs on one side and red thumbs on the other. Handed these out to people in the city of 2 million people. And then he had the mimes come in. And the mimes stood at the intersection and they directed traffic. And they would hold up a sign and engage the citizenry, the other pedestrians. So if someone ran a red light, they would hold up a sign, "Incorrecto," and everybody would whip out their card and show the red thumb down, and the driver would see this and feel shame because he was being humiliated. And shame, to the Latin soul, is crushing. You don't want to be ashamed in front of all your peers. You want to be praised. And so they would show, with good behavior, they would show correcto, and they would celebrate, and they would have instruments and blow their horns, and people would show the green sign, and so they celebrated good behavior. And it was so successful in their prototype that they increased the number of mimes to 400 mimes, and traffic behavior changed within a week, permanently. Permanent change in traffic behavior. When you listen to Mokas describe his work, he's not guessing. This was the fascinating thing about him. He wasn't guessing. He was playing an instrument. He understood the mind and the soul of his people so well that he constructed an instrument and he played it. He triggered the empathy and the love and the warmth, the humanity in the other person to invite a different behavior. And he had a whole taxonomy, a whole artistic science to this. Now, before the mimes went out, the night before the mimes went out, someone said, "What happens when the first mime gets shot?" And there's no good answer to that question, but he decided to do it anyway, and no one got shot. And Mokas went on to drive behavior change in many other specific areas around violence against women and water usage and smoking, and I can't remember them all right now. But he had a method of inviting people to change themselves. So this is co-creation. The difference is who actually drives the change. Okay, so people ask Mokas, well, what's the difference between what you're doing and propaganda or social engineering? He said, it's very easy. My hands are on the table. So he would say to everybody, we're going to play a game. It's called good driving. And he was a student of Habermas, and he had an ethics, and he had a code, and he was articulate, so he could define the terms of the game, and you were free to play or not. The mimes had no policing power. They could not write you a traffic ticket. It was simply an invitation. I read another story, and we're short on time. I knew we would, because we only have an hour, but I want you to look these up if you're interested. There's another example of this co-creation, and I would say at scale. Working with a city of 2 million people is different than working with 200 in a room. You can't talk to everybody. You're going to have haters. You got to be very smart in how you do that. Eddie Rama, there was a story the other night of the town of Gray. Who told that story? Yeah. So this is a real-life story of the town of Gray. Tirana, Albania. Albania endured 70 years of communism in which they lost 40,000 churches. The entire culture was gutted. And in the Soviet era, these large, gray, cheap buildings arose everywhere. When Eddie Rama became mayor, he was an artist. He inherited he became mayor of the poorest city in Europe. Open sewers, rampant criminality in all forms, and a decaying infrastructure. And he had $100,000 in the bank to, do something with Tirana. Today he's Prime Minister of Albania, by the way, so this is a success story. So what he did was he started to paint these gray buildings. Paint them these wild colors. Painting buildings, painting buildings, painting buildings. So what the citizens saw and heard was that, we're going to paint some buildings. And this gray building became like this abstract, colorful thing there. So he started painting buildings. And at one point, to stimulate dialogue, to stimulate the culture again. And at one point, he asked, he sent out a survey to the residents of Tirana. with two questions. Do you like the colors? And do you want it to stop? And or do you want it to continue? Okay, something like this. And some 40% of the people liked the colors, but some 60 or 70% of the people wanted it to continue. So even those people who didn't like the colors wanted it to continue. Because what happened? What happened was he woke up people. He began the dialogue. He began the discourse that eventually led to warmth flowing again. Joseph Beuys called this the warmth sculpture. It's a good idea, right? The warmth sculpture. He was rekindling the source of society. And where does the source of society live? It lives within people. Now, I want you to get this, because this method ignores what lives within people. Whereas this method utilizes what lives within people at scale. So what we were doing is we were bringing warmth to these stakeholders, but treating the rest of the people as parts in a machine, pieces of a system, recipients. What Rama and Mokas, and there's many others I could list, did was to engage the latent healing and creative power of the human being in action. So he didn't control then what happened, neither Mokas nor Rama. And the people who do this successfully, they don't need to control what happens next. What happens next is once people come back to life, criminality disappears or decreases because they have options. They're in touch with each other. Money begins to circulate more freely. Okay, Albania is no longer the poorest country in Europe, I don't think. Anyway, after this, the country began to come back to life. The city, then the country, then he became prime minister. And the way that he describes it is he helped Tirana and Albania transition. No, this was Mokas. Mokas said, but it applies in Rama's case too. He helped the city and the country move out of a traumatized, stuck mess. These weren't his words. I can't remember how he said it. An unworkable situation. From an unworkable situation to a city with problems. Now, what does this have to do with you? I'm going to just land this with an exercise. And I want to talk for 5 minutes about what does this paradigm mean for the social future? In my view, the most promising, most interesting, most genius and far-reaching way of thinking about the social future is called social threefolding. It comes out of the work of Rudolf Steiner. Steiner was a genius in many areas, but in social threefolding, there is a kind of understanding of society that it's a secret. It's an open secret. It's a key to how we're going to blossom and flourish as humanity in some point in the future. Okay, so I want to land this by doing a quick exercise. So just stand up real quick and find somebody that you don't know. Or don't know well. Okay, shh. Let's do this quickly. Let's do this quickly because I knew I would run out of time, but that's okay. So, huh? What, lunch is running late? Okay, so if you want to, we can stay a little bit longer, but if you have other things to do, you can go at noon. I don't mind. So, this person to you is a stranger, more or less. But I want you to turn and look at them in their eyes. Hold each other's glance. And I want you to bring to mind any label that you might have for this person. Short, tall, scruffy, smelly, beautiful, handsome, attraction, repulsion, old, young, to this, to that. Bring any kind of label to mind. Do you need a partner over there? Come here. Do you need a partner too? Or do you don't have to do it, but y'all are both unpartnered. Or do you already know each other? No. Okay. Bring the label to mind. Their nationality, their haircut, their body shape, their whatever. And now bring that label to mind and wipe it away. And I want you to realize that this person was once 4 years old. Who was this being when they were 4 years old? What was their nickname? Don't say, just ponder. Think about their past. Think about what they've grown through, what they might have endured, what they may have suffered. And now imagine them growing up, going through those trials and suffering that, and going into their future. They go out of this room, they go on to live their life. They endure more suffering and trials and victories and relationships and life and love and death. Eventually, they pass on. This person is an irreducible being. Every human is an irreducible being. You cannot reduce them to a label. Can you see that? This person is an utter mystery to you. And I want you to just land in your heart for a moment more the irreducible individuality. Does everybody know what that word is? It cannot be simplified, and they are an individual. They are a one of one. They're an individual. They're unique. And I want you to see each other now as equals. If you really see each other, you will see the dignity of the other human being, and you will feel that person in some respect equally deserving of love, of sunshine, of life, of beauty, of joys and triumphs and prosperity. They are every bit as equally deserving as you. And thirdly, I want you to imagine what they will bring into the world out of their uniqueness, out of their innate creative talents and their potentials. Are they a storyteller? Are they a healer? Are they a teacher? Are they an artist? Are they a whiz with money or real estate? What contribution will they make? And imagine that in a broader system of many contributions, that somehow you depend on them making their contribution. Okay, let's sit back down. So here's the last thought for today's session, and then it will have to be continued, right? Individual, equal, and interdependent. This is one way. It's not the only way. It's a very I would say, tangible way to comprehend what Rudolf Steiner called social threefolding. Think of society as with a fractal principle. Everybody know what a fractal is? It's the same properties at all scales. So an individual, right? Just you. But now the next scale is you and your partner, or your friend, or your parent. That's two people. And now another scale is 3 people or more. Families, teams, organizations, institutions, nations, or communities, regions. Fractal in nature. Because why? Because these 3 vectors are always expressing themselves in different ways. These are the phenomena, the primary phenomena of social life, from this particular point of view. We are individuals in this sphere of culture. More and more in human evolution, individuals decide what they believe, who they are. We no longer have to be what the chief of the tribe says we have to be in most societies. There's a great degree of individual potential in the individual consciousness. I'm not talking about what's allowed, but I'm talking about in the individual consciousness, there's a huge potential to individualize, to say, I am going to have blue hair. I'm going to be a Muslim-Christian hybrid, agnostic kind of person. Thank you very much. And so on. So this sphere arises of diverse individuals and beliefs. And Rudolf Steiner complicates the picture by saying this is where we potentially have freedom. What he means by that is we potentially can free ourselves from habit and compulsion, and if we do the inner development, we can act out of love instead of mere compulsion or compliance or tradition or conditioning or woundedness. It's a potential for freedom. This is the sphere of governance. Or this, I would say, this gives rise, more or less organically, to the sphere of governance, where through mutual agreement, not force or regime, through mutual agreement, we interact as equals. We all stop at stop signs. We as builders conform to building codes so the buildings don't fall down and kill people. We agree to operate within certain reasonable legal frameworks. And where we are interdependent, we give rise to economy. Because no one in a modern world is physically independent. No one takes care of all of their own needs. We help each other. I make shoes, you make chairs, he's a teacher, she's a doctor, etc. So this is a way of thinking that builds on this idea of co-creation. What are we creating? What I have found in my practice, and I would go into it if we had another hour, is that when we mutually understand the pictures embedded here, we can have dialogue. We can have very constructive dialogue around such practical things as education, medicine, necessary legal frameworks, economic exchange, and we can continue to look for the phenomena that might express themselves and not merely be subject to tradition, habit, belief, dogma, and established convention. This is where we can become creative with our society as a sculpture that we all make together. So I'm going to leave it there because we're out of time. But I would suggest that, if we find more time or if we want to continue, there is an infinite richness here to be discovered where these spheres interact and nourish each other. If we cultivate in our education the minds and the souls of individuals, they bring into expression a dignity that they can see others and treat others with dignity in the sphere of equality, and they bring their talents into the sphere of economy, and so on and so on and so forth. And so some of my friends and clients and myself and Louisa are engaged in an exercise right now of discovering and uncovering what the phenomena are that express themselves at different levels of a fractal in this sort of organic threefolding way. And it's extraordinarily interesting. It gives me hope as a social sculptor that in time, humanity, increasing numbers of people can recognize the signatures of tyranny and compliance and instead understand where dialogue and where mutual activation of creative and healing impulses can serve society better than dictates from above. So this I want to land with you as kindling for your flame of hope, that you become a smart, wise, perceptive social sculptor in your work, that you understand the limits of planning and implementing your brilliant idea with lots of money and power, and the power, the fourth dimensional power, the extraordinary power of engaging the hearts and minds of others that can then unlock goodwill and exchange and equality in the minds and souls of many persons. Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much, Jeff,
Welcome.
to dive us into this topic of sculpture our own work and sculpture our initiatives, and on touching at the concept of freefolding. This exercise I was together with B really touched me and made me also very sensitive in a way and really let me feel human. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, dear audience, for listening, and also let you guide through this exercise then. And we will have lunch now. At the other workshops will take place, and see you then. And if you have other questions, Jeff, he's there.